I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake,
I'm Rosie.
and this is our Christmas special. I was mentioning last time the occasion when there was a truckload of Christmas specials to watch on demand a few years ago, within 10 years certainly. We watched quite a few of them. I was mentioning there how the Only Fools and Horses ones were quite enlightening in some ways about the show as a whole. There are some other Christmas special memories I've taken away from that. Rugrats is one I remember enjoying. Angelica ringing up somebody and demanding, "I want to talk to Santa." I think she was spending the episode doing that thing where you've been naughty and you try to make up for it by being nice, in the hopes that she was going to get her Cynthia Beach house instead of a lump of coal. And what she ended up getting was the Cynthia Beach house with a lump of coal in the garage. The Powerpuff Girls had a bit I found rather fun and memorable, where Santa had this ultra naughty list that had people on it that were so naughty they could never get any presents and never get on the nice list. I think Princess was either trying not to get on this list or get herself crossed off it. And when we saw the list, it consisted of the names of the siblings of the main crew creators of the Powerpuff Girls. Many of the things we've already talked about in our regular podcasts have Christmas specials in the cases of the shows, and are Christmas movies in the cases of things like Look Who's Talking Now and Jurassic World.
And the Muppet Christmas Carol.
And I'm sure we've mentioned Christmas in many of those podcasts. The Vicar of Dibley, for example, the first Christmas special there, the Christmas lunch incident, is the best one.
I love that. That's my favourite episode of The Vicar of Dibley. It cracks me up. Also, Mr. Bean's Christmas episode is a very strong one.
And of course, Christmas is a very important time for the subject of one of our very early podcasts, the Chipmunks, with their very famous Christmas song. That was a way for the 21st century movies to get back into the whole chipmunk situation. And indeed, the same is true of the 80s cartoon, which began with a Christmas special pilot.
They had that on TV one Christmas when I was quite a child, I think. It said in the Radio Times something about Alvin and the Chipmunks Christmas cartoon. I thought, oh right, I'll get up and watch that. And it turned out to be not quite what I was expecting, because it was weird in the way that a pilot is often quite different from the main series. Ross Bagdasarian Jr. hadn't quite worked out how to do the performance yet. The character designs were a bit, I was going to say strange looking. Perhaps if they'd stuck with them and I hadn't got used to the others, they wouldn't have been strange looking but different. And the story was one of those ones about giving to the needy. And of course it began with them singing their Christmas song, with which Ross Bagdasarian Sr. introduced the characters to the world. The only Christmas Chipmunks episode I remember seeing in the main series was an Alvin's Christmas Carol type of thing. And remembering that makes me think about how many people have a Christmas Carol. A person in an episode of Quantum Leap, Blackadder, of course.
There's an episode of Back to the Future, the animated series, where Marty does that to a Tannen ancestor called Epiphnezer Tannen.
And then there are several film versions of it, and we've already mentioned one, the Muppet Christmas Carol.
We had a homemade Christmas DVD at one point, which had Christmas specials from some of the shows we've mentioned in these podcasts. Third Rock from the Sun was on there, that got mentioned briefly last time. Pinky and the Brain Christmas special, by far the best episode ever of Pinky and the Brain. And a big highlight for a Christmas special has for some years been Earthworm Jim, with his take on the kidnapping of Santa story.
Another thing we had on that DVD was The Tailor of Gloucester, from the Beatrix Potter cartoon adaptation that's got a couple of different names. The World of Peter Rabbit and Friends, Beatrix Potter, The Animated Tales. And what was very charming about that was how the style of animation was exactly the style of her illustrations, and a frame of animation would be exactly what she had drawn. I do rather like The Tailor of Gloucester. Simpkin the cat, who's a very good cat character, and it was the first time they'd bothered getting Neve Cusack to film a different beginning in Beatrix Potter's Christmas Town House.
And the other thing we had on that Christmas DVD was the sequel to The Snowman, by which I don't mean The Snowman and the Snow Dog. I mean the other adaptation of a Christmas picture book actually written by Raymond Briggs, which was called Father Christmas, and was meant to give an insight into what does Father Christmas get up to on the other 364 days of the year, specifically when he decides to take a round-the-world holiday. I don't think he does that every year. If you're wondering about whether it really has the right to call itself a sequel to The Snowman, the original books were published the other way around, actually. It does, because the characters from The Snowman, the boy and the snowman, make a cameo appearance in Father Christmas at the appropriate point when he goes to the snowman's Christmas party on Christmas Eve, and says to the boy, "Glad you can make it again." The party, I mean, not your snowman. Actually, he means both of them, doesn't he? That's Mel Smith there doing the voice of Father Christmas, and we very much used to enjoy watching that. It had been on video for a long time and ended up on that Christmas DVD.
I think we'd recorded over our copy of The Snowman a long time ago because we never wanted to watch it.
I was thinking about The Snowman the other day, thinking about doing this podcast, and I was coming to the conclusion that it really is one of those things that's mucking about to music. One of those cartoons, which, as I've said before, is not the sort of cartoon we used to enjoy watching.
Neither of us was at all into stories without words, and Mel Smith with his words, and a few supporting actors as well, like the lady hosting the Christmas party, telling him where he can go to the toilet, that sort of thing. Child saying, "Mum, it's Father Christmas." All makes for a proper story, in my opinion, and Mel Smith's performance and the direction he was given are a rather sort of a grumpy Father Christmas, and it starts off, I seem to remember, with him giving us a bit of a lecture about if we think he's idle for most of the year, all the jobs he has to do, looking after the reindeer and such, which wouldn't make much of a story, so yes, we get his holiday.
Yeah, of course, it's an amalgamation of two Raymond Briggs picture books about Father Christmas, really.
Funny thing about that is he doesn't live in the North Pole or anywhere like it. He seems to live in a sort of ordinary house in England and get his milk delivered and have a pet cat and dog and all that kind of very ordinary thing.
And that's really what never satisfied me about it. They make some jokes out of it, like the great big lorry load of letters getting delivered to his house and having to order 500 teddy bears and so on. And things like that made me think, well, I do prefer to see him living not in a normal house somewhere in England, but at the North Pole in his workshop with his elves making the toys. That's the one drawback of this Father Christmas setup for me. Which is why I'm particularly glad that, from childhood, there has been in our house a Christmas movie with that correct Santa setup. And that is the 1985 movie called Santa Claus, often talked and written about as Santa Claus the movie, for clarity, very much like Superman the movie. And of course Santa Claus the movie was mentioned when we talked about Superman the movie because they are extremely similar in some ways. The involvement of much of the same crew,
including the screenwriter, who's very much responsible for the structure that they have in common. An origin story that takes place over a number of minutes of the film and a number of years of the character's life, or in the case of Santa Claus, a number of centuries. A main villain introduced about halfway through. And there are a couple of things that are coincidental, such as that the main character has a secret base in the North Pole and flies around the world.
And the actor playing that character ends up getting shoved down to third billing behind the person whose name they think is going to attract people to the film the most, be it Marlon Brando or Dudley Moore. And then the main villain, Gene Hackman and John Lithgow. It doesn't seem to be very highly thought of, Santa Claus the movie. I remember first finding it in the Radio Times, with its 2 stars out of 5, and I thought, well, they've written it up very stupidly to make it sound like it's stupid. one of Santa's elves runs away from the North Pole and joins forces with a disgraced toy maker in New York or something, the blurb said, and I thought, yes, well, that does happen in that second part of the movie. It's certainly not a good blurb for the movie as a whole, and it's taking that particular sequence of events rather out of context. You need to see the whole thing, go through the journey with Patch that leads him to make that decision to run away to New York. It'd be a bit like if you tried to watch that episode of Digimon, and the blurb said a giant teddy bear and a giant cactus have a boxing match.
Or Sam Beckett wanders about holding hands with a chimpanzee wearing a nappy and carrying a tranquilizer gun.
Sounds really stupid by itself, but if you watch the build-up and you know what's happening and why it's happening, it makes a great deal of sense. It's very engaging.
I was reading the reception section of its Wikipedia page the other day and basically found out that it's popular in Britain and not in America. So the fact that we like it backs that up, really.
Of course, I always preferred, and I think you did too, that first half, that origin story. That's really the very magical, engaging for children bit. We were watching the trailer on the DVD the other day, and it was saying the film is packed full of the magic of Christmas, the wonder of Christmas, packed full of Christmas spirit. The kind-hearted woodcutter with the skill for making toys, delivering them to the children for Christmas, became Santa Claus as we know him today and have known him for the past 700 years since that origin story was taking place. Meeting the elves and seeing them go about their business rhythmically and colourfully, with all the wonderful score going on. Probably the best bit of the movie, really, and certainly the bit, I think, that's very engaging for children.
Well, I remember watching it in the school hall when it was very nearly the Christmas holidays, and rather like when we went to see Beauty and the Beast in the cinema. I didn't know what was going to appear on the screen and had no expectations whatsoever, and got absolutely caught up. And yes, that origin story, first half of the film, is brilliant for children, certainly British children. And I was being reminded the other day of Drop Dead Fred, where I made a point on our podcast about the use of sets and costumes to create effects. So does Santa Claus the movie, with its colourful, rustic Santa HQ. Lots of nice, pretty-looking snow when things are going well, and more of a sort of slushy, grey environment when things aren't going quite so well in New York. BZ's office when we get to the second half, very sharp corners and dark colours and not such a welcoming environment. And BZ's house, which we don't realise it's BZ's house for a while because the people we see in it are Cornelia, and her nanny, which is very big, full of toys, full of the things that Corny needs, but no love. When Patch, in his bright clothes that blended in so well and made him part of the North Pole Santa's workshop setting, appears in BZ's dark, sharp-cornered, expensive-looking office. The contrast between them is very effective and adds to the contrast between Patch with his Christmassy idealism and not knowing very much about money, and BZ wanting to get out of trouble for making dangerous toys and make sure he can stay very wealthy, having this capitalist attitude towards Christmas, the commercialism of Christmas.
Yes, even when we were little, it's not like we didn't enjoy that second half of the movie very much as well. Before thinking about and analysing things like that, of course, you still enjoy the effects. Joe and Corny do a wonderful job, don't they, as the child characters in that part. And of course, John Lithgow is extremely entertaining as BZ. Greedy and despicable, but very funny as well. You were reading how John Lithgow had said he didn't really like the movie, thought it was tacky, but he does do some wonderful work in it, making us laugh and making us think.
He also said he wished he had a nickel for every Englishman who told him it was his favourite film.
But of course, throughout the movie, I've always really appreciated David Huddleston. He really did make an excellent Santa Claus. Everything about him in the role is genuine. The height, the bulk, the beard, the demeanour, what he puts into his acting, all makes a very genuine Santa Claus that you really believe in. And that's not an easy thing to do on screen. And I think David Huddleston does the best job of anyone ever of bringing that all together. And he's backed up rather nicely at the North Pole by Judy Cornwell as Anya, his wife. And all the British actors under 6 feet they could find playing the elves. We recognise quite a few of them. Melvin Hayes, Christopher Ryan, Anthony O'Donnell as Puffy, of course, and the actor who plays Dooley, who's kind of the chief main elf who mainly interacts with Santa, is called John Barrard, and I think he does a wonderful job in that role.
Donna and Blitzen are their two reindeer who pull them about the snowy landscape on their sleigh. The other 6 reindeer are already there with the elves, and of course those ones are Comet, Cupid, Dasher, Dancer, Prancer and Vixen. They use the names from A Visit from St. Nicholas, and that poem is in fact read out in the film, so evidently the writer somehow got wind of the real names of the reindeer.
There are just those 2 little inserts between the late 13th century and the late 20th century. The first one being the decision to reward only the good children. And then 100 years later or so, Dooley is reading out The Night Before Christmas, and Santa Claus is rather perturbed by the physical description. And he's right, isn't he? He doesn't have a little round belly at all. He has a belly that is in proportion with the rest of him. And it leads to that stupid situation which I've mentioned for Poirot. It's not funny for Poirot, it's not funny for Santa Claus, where they have to start being fed celery and things and don't like it.
The reindeer are usually animatronic. Sometimes they're real reindeer when you see all 8 of them at once harnessed to the sleigh. And actually, that film taught me what reindeer look like, because in such things as Raymond Briggs' Father Christmas and other kind of illustrations and stuff I'd seen, the reindeer don't look like reindeer, they just look like kind of standard fallow deer or something. When Patch is introducing all the reindeer, I remember most of them are animatronic and Dasher is real, jumping around to demonstrate that he loves to run, he really does. And that's a good scene to establish that Patch has this relationship with the reindeer later on when he's in danger several hundred years later. Santa has to spur them into flying their best, even though they've only just done Christmas. If there hadn't been a scene where Patch interacted with them, the audience wouldn't believe in that at all, would they? It's the sort of thing that they do now. Miss an important detail like that.
Yes, that thrilling rescue scene is the culmination of the 700-year personal journey that Donna has been on, which ends up with him finally leading the way in the Super Duper Looper.
I will just say I'm not quite convinced the Super Duper Looper is the only way to rescue Patch and Joe from the car full of exploding candy canes, but never mind. It's a fitting climax.
What do you think of Dudley Moore as Patch?
He's a big part of that whole Elf Santa's Workshop setup, and he fits into it so well that you might not specifically remember him until he starts to have a bit more to do with the plot, but I think he's very good in that role. I think he really commits. I think the way the script builds up to what happens to him in the end is very effective. When we first meet him, he takes a look under Santa's sleigh and comments on the craftsmanship to introduce the idea that he's an expert craftsman, he's an innovator. And he also says, I can see I'm going to have a lot to teach him, which very quickly and clearly introduces this idea that he is willful and he wants to share his ideas and put his ideas out there, use them to help, but also possibly at times come across as a little overconfident. I think he plays off John Lithgow very well. His naivety and lack of familiarity with 20th century New York comes across very effectively. He is excited to take his flying car out and deliver his lollipops, and he's excited to go back home to the North Pole and take Santa Joe and a load of candy canes as an offering when he's welcomed back into the fold. And his joy and enthusiasm come across really quite well, I think.
It's very good, some of that early stuff with Patch as well, isn't it? You were mentioning establishing his close relationship with the reindeer and looking at the runners on Santa's original sleigh, and that leads on to things like Patch trying to get Santa interested in his inventions. He's got plans to heat the place using pipes. So on the whole, yes, I think he's woven very well into the whole movie as a character, and Dudley Moore has done a very good job bringing him to life in the right ways, with the right emotions, all the way through.
Puffy gives a quote that I find quite memorable when he's showing Santa his new doll that whips, apparently. Unfortunately, the prop is a cloth doll, but anyway, what he says is children ought to like it. And that really just sums up what anyone who makes any toy, children's movie, holiday activity, anything like that, they just try and think of something where they can truthfully say children ought to like it. And sometimes they're wrong, and sometimes they're right. When looking at the commercialism of Christmas, they actually kind of have a bit of a dig at movie sequels. When Beezy announces that he's going to bring out the candy cane straight away, he says the people are dying for a sequel. We can call it Christmas 2. And Patch is looking absolutely perplexed and muttering, Christmas 2? As if to say a movie is like Christmas, where you capture something magical, and if you make a conscious, deliberate effort to recapture it and stick the number 2 on it just to make money, it's really not the same.
So yeah, they put a lot of time and effort and work in at least 3 different countries into making Santa Claus the movie. And while it may not quite have achieved the worldwide appreciation that the filmmakers were hoping it would get, it's certainly a Christmas favourite and a Christmas mainstay in our lives. It's a Wonderful Life is a very famous Christmas movie, often referenced and parodied. The particular parody we've talked about before is the Tiny Toons one, and it is a very good parody and references the actual film in a lot of amusing ways. Buster Bunny and his wish that he was never on Tiny Toon.
When we finally saw the film, we finally understood why Babs was all frumpy with glasses and a silly hat at the end.
And I remember finally understanding why in that episode of The Simpsons it's the teachers' strike one, isn't it? When Bart goes to the bank and starts this rumour the bank is out of money. Someone comes out of the back all panicked doing a James Stewart impression saying, your money's in Bill's house and Fred's house. So yeah, you never know where It's a Wonderful Life is going to turn up being referenced or parodied.
It happens to Kermit as well in It's Very Merry Muppet Christmas.
It took us quite a long time to get round to watching the film, but we very much enjoyed it when we did finally have a look at it one Christmas, and we watched it a few Christmases since, and eventually got hold of a second-hand DVD of it. It's a feel-good Christmas movie. It keeps you feeling very involved in George Bailey's life and his problems and the sacrifices he makes for others. Never puts himself first. I sometimes find myself assessing the situation rather like Mr. Potter, the antagonist, does. George Bailey, a bit of a sap, puts everyone else first. But of course that's not the right way to think of it at all, is it? George Bailey is a very good person.
He's the richest man in town, as his brother Harry says, and of course he means spiritually. And he's married to Donna Reed, Mary, and has 4 children, and the values and ideology of the film are very much that love and family are more important than material wealth.
And it's true, it is heartwarming and thought-provoking how much George does help the people of Bedford Falls. What a pit they all would have been in, if indeed they would have survived, without him, as the alternative reality sequence which is the most famous part of the film, I should think, shows us in no uncertain terms.
If it isn't the original alternative reality sequence, I'll be very surprised to find out there was an earlier one. And it's definitely influenced other alternative reality sequences. It reminds one quite a lot of Back to the Future 2. There's a gravestone. There are several people doing a Mr. Strickland and not having any idea who George is, because of course he was never born. The only thing that's a bit surprising, because it's not like Back to the Future 2, is that Mary is an old maid. She never married and she's about to close the library. Like, that's the most terrible thing. And of course, it's of its time. Mary has been shown to be very much what a woman ought to be, a wife, a mother, giving out soup and stuff during the war. And we were very surprised the first time that she wasn't married to Sam Wainwright, who phoned up to propose to her with some floozy all over him on the other end of the phone. And I do wonder if that was the original idea, that she would marry the wrong man, and then someone said, well, hang on a minute, that's not so bad as long as she's married someone.
It's funny the way that's presented, isn't it? The very apex of what's gone wrong thanks to George's wish. George has just found his brother's gravestone. He died by falling through the ice at age 9 because you weren't there to save him, although the gravestone mistakenly said he was 8. And of course this led to Harry not being able to rescue the 2 boatloads of US soldiers from the kamikaze pilots in the war. That puts everything on a grand scale, doesn't it? But then the next thing that's revealed, very worst possible thing, Mary's an old maid and she's about to close the library.
It's got a fantastic cast, of course. Jimmy Stewart is very engaging and funny when the occasion calls for it, and emotional when the occasion calls for it. And I believe in him and his relationships and his genuine desire to help people and stop them all from living in Mr. Potter's slums, despite what he's sacrificing himself. And he does make you like the character. The script makes you like the character, but without the right actor to bring it to life, it wouldn't work. Another important character is Uncle Billy, who's a bit of a bumbler. The alternative reality reveals that he couldn't keep the savings and loan open on his own, and in fact he never got the chance to try, if you remember the committee getting together and deciding what was to become of it after Peter Bailey, George's father, died. And it's his fault in the end that $8,000 is mislaid and George is contemplating suicide because of all the consequences. And I think it's right narratively that he has a $15,000 life insurance policy, because it does make suicide a selfless act. Clarence, of course, comes and says, I'm your guardian angel, I've known you since you were a little boy, and all that kind of thing. And we're sort of like, well, no, you haven't, because the beginning of the film is St. Peter or somebody telling Clarence he's got this mission to save George, and then we, the audience, are in Clarence's position as the stars explain to us, this is George, look what he's been doing his whole life and how he's ended up here. And that's obviously an idea that someone's had later, because Clarence appearing in answer to George's prayer a few minutes later and saying, I'm your guardian angel, doesn't quite fit, but it's close enough that they've kept it in anyway.
Yes, Clarence sees George for a bit when he's 12, saving his brother's life and preventing Mr. Gower, the druggist, from accidentally poisoning Kid, and then we're straight in with him at age 21. We have laughed in the past about Uncle Billy always being called Uncle Billy, even in the alternative reality, where he only was an uncle for 8 or 9 years before Harry fell through the ice and died. George's mother still knows him as your brother-in-law, Uncle Billy.
In Jimmy Stewart's joy at reality being restored, it's very heartwarming and very believable the way he does it. Kissing the bit of banister that always comes off in their crappy old house when he goes upstairs that he's been so annoyed with. Sort of like A Christmas Carol in that respect. You see him reacting to certain people and things, and then after he's had his epiphany, reacting to the same things in a different way. And it's all just very nice and heartwarming and Christmassy, that ending. Where the people who he's helped give him money to help him when he's in trouble, or crowd into his house and show how much they love him. And Sam Wainwright's role in the end is to wire him up to $25,000 to get him out of trouble, because he's such a good guy and no one ever mentions again that he had been wanting to marry Mary. One thing I like about it is that when anyone has been thinking of marrying someone, Sam Wainwright with Mary, this other character who we haven't mentioned, Violet, has a bit of a thing for George. Don't marry that person, they marry somebody else. There's no hard feelings, no resentment. Everyone's still nice and friendly with each other, including George and Violet, Sam and George and Mary, and Sam's wife that he's found and we see in one scene, whoever she may be. Everyone in the film is a nice person except for Mr. Potter, who's this incredibly despicable villain who just wants to make everybody's life crap and make money for himself. And that's very effectively done, and that makes you really get behind George and what he's doing to protect everybody from Mr. Potter.
So there we are. Plenty of thoughts and memories about some of our enduring Christmas viewing. We'll be back sometime in 2025 to talk to you about some of the things we've enjoyed solely in the 21st century, i.e. things that were not around in the olden days at all. So do join us again for that. And in the meantime, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year out there.
Whatever you are.